people that are saying, I'm not racist, and yet but they're not willing to be nuanced about saying, but I understand that there are terrible things, and I understand that I have even played a part in that.
Right.
And on the other side, you have this, this seems like an attitude of, you're wrong, and we just need to get rid of you, and no trying to find any connection, right?
Right. Both sides of that polarization fuel one another, right? Because when you're in a relationship that lacks mercy and forgiveness, then there's no room for mistakes.
3, 2, 1. Welcome to Love Machine.
Welcome to another Nerding Out with That Nerdy Catholic. I am Seth Payne, That Nerdy Catholic. And today we have on a returning guest we've had on a couple times. Dr. Brent Robbins is a professor of psychology at Point Park University in Pittsburgh. I always love saying that. It's like the pickled peppers.
There's a lot of peas.
And there are a lot of peas. And today we're going to be talking about mercy, and especially what it means to have mercy in this modern culture that we live in. So, Brent, before we get into it, share with us a little bit of how has mercy come into the studies that you've done, the work that you've done in psychology.
Yeah. Personally, in the way that I've come into it is studying the history of psychology. So I teach courses, undergraduate and graduate level, in the sort of history and systems and theories of psychology. And so I'm interested in how psychological concepts sort of enter into the lexicon, enter into the conversation in psychology, and also when they disappear in the social and cultural circumstances around that. So when I started looking at mercy as a construct, it really begins to enter into the English language in the 12th century. And it comes to the English through the French. And then from the French, it's a translation of the Latin misericordia. And so when I started to look at that time period, it was really interesting to look at French culture and how it was incorporating this Christian and Latin concept of misericordia, which really, if you translate it literally, it means to sort of suffer with the other. It's probably most accurately translated as compassion, because compassion, to suffer with the other, right? So misericordia has that meaning. It's what's when charity is talked about in Scripture, in the Latin Vulgate, misericordia is the term that they use. So mercy becomes the word that's a translation of misericordia into French, and then finally into English. And around that, so I was looking at high Middle Ages and what was happening in French culture at that time, and noticed that Thomas Aquinas, I think, had a big influence because of his emphasis on charity and therefore mercy as a virtue, but also in the writings on reconciling what many see as a paradox or a contradiction between mercy and justice. So that's kind of what got me interested in it. And then I also got interested in the fact that when you see modern psychology, which is usually when people teach history of psychology, they don't start, like in ancient Greece. They start, maybe in the 17th century, usually, late 19th century, right? And everything before that's just ignored and seen as, backward and part of the Dark Ages or whatever, dismissed as being irrelevant. And what I found was that there is a marked absence of any study of mercy in psychology. It's just, if you look at, if you go, even today, if you go in the research literature and you type in mercy in psychology, very little comes up. If it does, it's usually like maybe a journal in pastoral psychology or something like that, or theology and psychology, but not mainstream sort of secular culture. You do see a lot of research starting in the 2000s on forgiveness And there's a lot of overlap between research on forgiveness and mercy. And but even that was neglected for a long time. So psychology has not focused on that. And so that was interesting to me. What happened? Why was mercy such a central concept within the culture starting in the High Middle Ages? And it had, by the way, enormous impact on the culture. So in the pagan ethics, you really saw the viewpoint that mercy and justice were opposed to one another. Mercy was sort of a travesty of justice, because if you forgave someone for an offense and you didn't punish them for it, then you were essentially allowing that justice to go unresolved, right?
Right.
And so this idea that mercy and justice are not opposed but compatible is a very radical idea that comes out of the Christian tradition. And so I think that part of what's happened is, as the Christian ethos has begun to wane in Western culture, and even there's hostility to it, certainly in academia, and I think in the scientific community around this time, around the birth of modern psychology, there's overt hostility to the church. There a lot of science at this time is asserting a kind of positivism whose very identity depends upon a kind of rejection of church teaching and church authority, especially in France.
Well, so thinking about what when you have mercy or compassion or forgiveness, there's a wrong, like you said, there's a wrong that needs to be forgiven. Do you think that there's this lack of study of mercy, forgiveness, and compassion? Is there any connection with that and the lack of an understanding of sin or evil that is kind of built into us, and not just some people that do evil things?
Right.
But
Yeah.
it's something that's part of us.
That's a really interesting question, because the other thing that I've been studying a lot, I had a student do her dissertation on when addiction became conceptualized as a medical disease. When did that concept emerge? And she was able to trace it back to a French physician in mid-19th century France, like publishing this idea around 1847. And I promise this is going to get back to your question. But what she found was that not mercy, but the idea, this idea of sin was still part of this idea of addiction as a disease at that time. There was a whole movement in medicine to try to secularize what had been traditionally more church directed discussions, or more religious discussions about how moral issues can impact mental health and well-being. So there was that was still very much there. In fact, in Morrill, who was the physician that she was studying, was himself a Catholic. He was a fairly radical left sort of Catholic who was tied to a kind of Catholic socialism at that time, but still a Catholic, and saw that really what he saw as conditions of social injustice, like poverty at that time, were contributing to conditions that lent themselves to addiction. And I think in many cases he was right. I mean, in that many conditions of poverty, conditions of in this case, there's a lot of post-traumatic stress, because literally every 2 years there's some kind of revolution happening in France at this time, and people being killed, and within people's lifetimes you had the terror. So I think Morrill was aware that there was a kind of what he called a degeneration of the culture, and that was impacting people mentally. But a lot of this was also about perpetuation of kinds of sin that was corrupting families and the culture, and that people were suffering from that. But he thought that became physical, right? That it had physical manifestations, that it caused degeneration in the brain and the nervous system, and that could actually be passed along genetically and culturally to the next generation, and that you had a degeneration of the person and the family over time. But within a generation, within about, let's say that was 1847, by the 1880s, there's a shift in the discourse towards understanding addiction primarily as a biological problem.
Okay.
and that required biological solutions. So you get a loss of this idea of sort of sin or morality contributing to psychological problems.
Yeah. Well, it seems that looking at a lot of the shifts in that era towards more of a secular understanding of psychology, as well as a lot of areas of life, that people looked back at the church and at scripture and said, there are all these things that are looked at as spiritual issues.
Right.
And yet we know that there's a physical or a psychological component to it. Therefore, the spiritual side must just be something that they made up to explain it, and it's just physical or psychological.
Right. I think so. Right. Yeah. So, so in certain aspects of the culture, mid 1800s, people are still accepting that there's a spiritual component, but that the spiritual component has a psychological and a physical component. They don't see those as incompatible. By the 1880s, you see there was an anti-clerical sort of sentiment that was growing in French medical community over the course of that century, but really becomes empowered in the 1880s because of shifts in government that were happening in France at that time. And so the anti-cleric sort of came into power, and the church lost a lot of its power and authority in the culture. And one of the first things they did is they went in and got rid of all the clergy in the hospitals, including, the nuns that were working in the hospitals, and replaced them with sort of secular nurses and doctors and so on. So, and a big part of the rhetoric around that was that there were all these sort of backward ideas, going on in medicine, like that mental illness is really a biological problem, and that for a long time people thought that this had to do with sort of demons, and exorcism was the way to treat it. It was a very kind of unfair, anachronistic kind of way of sort of reading those ideas. There's this really interesting tension even at that time among some of the French physicians, because they don't all agree on that. Like Pierre Genet, for example, he really saw something to the church's understanding of possession and thought it had some meaning. He tried to understand it through hypnosis and the concepts of the unconscious, but he took it pretty seriously. And when he worked with a woman, for example, who was a mystic, who was in the hospital, he was very respectful of her religious beliefs. He felt that it was actually beneficial to her well-being to affirm her spirituality, even though he didn't agree with them or accept them. He thought that there was something to it that was worthy of respect. But then you had other physicians like Charcot, for example, who were overtly hostile to bringing any spiritual discussion. He thought it was regressive, and it would take us back to sort of a pre-scientific or anti-scientific sentimentality that medicine had to get rid of if it was going to progress.
Was it an issue on both sides, seeing this dichotomy of either, looking at it from a spiritual or a scientific point of view? Were there Catholics at the time that were trying to bridge both understandings? Yeah,
but the interesting thing is, I think that many people, when there's a kind of myth, that the church was anti-science at this time and was rejecting biological explanations. But what I'm starting to see, and for a long time, in my early training, I accepted that kind of myth. But then when I actually started reading the history, when I actually started reading the primary texts, what I was actually seeing was that the Catholic physicians at that time, and even the church, was not dismissive of the biological and the psychological dimension of things, but they saw the spiritual as, being part of that. And the other thing that you see happening around this time, again, starting around the mid 18th century, you see it in France, but you see it in other places, is where the church becomes much more rigorous in its investigation of claims of miracles and possession. And they begin to use scientific methodology as a way to do that. So the apparitions that were happening at that time, for example, at Lourdes, the apparition at Lourdes, and then the healings that were happening at Lourdes, suddenly you see compared to previous periods, a lot of empirical science and the bringing in of even secular medical doctors to evaluate the evidence when people had claims of healing that continues even today at Lourdes. It was clearly the church's affirmation of empirical science as a valuable form of knowing and something that was compatible with the church. The view is that the facts are friendly, and the church has nothing to fear from science. So this idea that the church,
if it's true, right?
Yeah,
if it's true, then it's true,
right? And there was a high bar, right? You had to really have clear, concrete evidence of a healing, and if something could be probably explained by spontaneous recovery, it would be rejected. It had to be something that was truly extraordinary for the church to accept it as a legitimate healing. And after a lot of scrutiny over many years. The same thing with the way miracles have begun to be investigated around this time. And even prior to this, there's a very high bar for evidence to support a miracle, and a lot of evidence has to be ushered in order to for the church to accept a claim of miracle as being credible. And anybody who's ever closely watched the canonization of a saint and the process for that knows that there's an enormous amount of research that goes into that, and any bishop that gets involved in that knows it's going to cost a lot of money. It's a very expensive project because there's a lot of experts who need to be brought in and to weigh in on the empirical evidence. That was all surprising to me. The first time I actually learned about that was actually a book. I'm going to forget the name of the author now, but the name of the book is called The Miracle Detective, and I know the author is a Rolling Stone editor, and he got involved in studying miracles initially because he thought he was going to expose it as being this ridiculous thing, like people finding images of Jesus in their toast in the morning or something like that. And so I think he went into it very much as a skeptic, but by the time he came out of it, he was almost converted. So the book he doesn't convert, he's sort of, but he's definitely shifted his attitude and saying there's something to this that's greater than what I assumed. And he even goes to Medjugorje and spends a lot of time in Medjugorje studying miracles there. But I think most of all, he leaves being impressed by the rigor of the church's investigation of these miracles and has a lot of respect for that. So I think that was the first time. If you haven't watched the earlier episodes, I was agnostic that had fallen away from the church. So when I was reading this book, it was during that period of time where I was still very much a skeptic. So that was reading that book was surprising to me at the time, and I think part of my journey, back home to the Catholic Church.
So people have this picture, at least of the clerical, the clerics at the time, the priests and other religious people, that they were stingent on they were stuck on their religious side and didn't want to think of the science, and it was the secular scientific people that were open-minded.
Right.
And yet, really, in a way, it's the other way around.
Right. And
so thinking about that's 100 years ago. I mean, over 100 years ago now. That mindset has crept in. I mean, I wouldn't even say crept in. It's become part of our culture.
Right.
And so thinking today about what life is like and thinking of this idea. I think you talked about this before, in talking about joy and your research in joy, that it seems novel,
right?
Although it shouldn't seem novel, because joy and mercy, that people have been thinking about this for centuries,
a long time.
But because of the world that we live in, this combination of this thinking of the religious concepts from any sort of a scientific viewpoint seems novel, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, studying joy is a good example of that, and mercy. In both cases, among my colleagues who, are not religious, probably more, along the lines of the unchurched, or maybe people are even anti-theistic who've sort of left the church and are hostile to it and to theism. When I encounter those people, they're very skeptical about that research, just because they know the history of it and that it has sort of religious connotations. But you could study anything empirically, and what I found is that you can develop a valid scientific measure of joy. And there's something called a Cronbach's alpha that measures the reliability of your instrument. And I've got a 0.92. It's about as high as you can get on a measure to show that it has internal consistency. That's one of the indications that you're studying something that's real and not just made up, and it correlates with all the other measures that we expect it would correlate. So we follow all of the rules of empirical scientific inquiry. And we have a measure that seems to be pointing to something that's real, and people understand what joy means. It's in the dictionary. People use it in every day. They might use it less now than maybe they did in the past because it emerges out of a spiritual tradition, but it's still part of the conversation. And and we do find that people who are more religious and spiritual tend to be higher in joy on those measures, but it's not absent in those who are not religious. They still have joy. They still are able to rate themselves on joy and understand what it means. So, and then we're able to do research on that. So what kinds of practices can contribute to joy? What kinds of personality characteristics are correlated with it? How is it correlated with mental health and well-being? And we're finding that joy in the research we're doing are really closely tied to some of the most interesting and important psychological constructs that we're studying now. Things like, speaking of the biological part, the insula in the brain is a part of the brain that is important for giving us feedback about what's happening in our body. When people have emotions, sometimes they call them feelings, and that's appropriate because emotions have a felt sense in the body, and the insula in the brain is an important organ for receiving that input from our body and informing us about our emotional state. And also it's important for empathy, because when I have compassion, when I'm suffering with the other, I resonate in my body with that other person's feelings as well. We have these mirror neurons that pick up what other people are feeling through their bodily gestures. And we can empathize with people. We can come to some understanding about what other people are feeling. And that's really essential for psychotherapeutic process. When that's not happening between a therapist and a client, therapy doesn't go well. It doesn't have positive outcomes like you see when there is empathy. And it's also important in interpersonal relationships, in marriages and friendships. So all this is there in the research literature. And we know it has a biological component, but it also has a psychological component. And we could say even maybe a spiritual component, that maybe when people develop a spiritual life, a kind of relationship to God, then that might cultivate just the type of conditions that create what I would call kind of unconditional joy, a capacity to find joy, to maintain a kind of joyful peace despite the circumstances of one's life, despite the material circumstances of one's life. And I think that's a high state of emotional maturity to have that capacity. And I think it's, a spiritual life seems to be a really important component of that.
Yeah. And so, like you've talked about with joy, that there are a number of people that don't want to think about anything that sounds spiritual, right? And so do you think that there's the kind of maybe a backlash of that, is that we're dealing with a lot of issues right now because there are so many nuns in our culture, the NONES, that don't want to think about anything that seems spiritual, that there is a rejection of mercy and compassion because those feel spiritual.
I think so. And I think that I can speak personally to this, and that when I have raised these questions to people that I know who are among the nuns, by the way, very smart people who I respect as being intellectually gifted, who I value as people, but I'm always surprised because of that, because they're people that I value. When I bring up these issues around mercy and the importance of forgiveness and agapic love, all of those things are very central to my thinking about psychology. And what it means to have healing relationships with one another,
Mm-hmm.
there's this pushback, like, oh, that sounds too spiritual, and rejection. I see that in students too when if it comes up in class. I've become more
Mm-hmm.
sensitive to that, and try to create a class where students who may not be religious or spiritual feel comfortable talking about their perspective. I'm not there to proselytize when I'm teaching at a secular university, but I'm so I want to create an inclusive environment, but I also don't want to not be share who I am and my beliefs. So I get to be included too, but so does everybody else. That's the fair way of thinking about inclusion. So I try to be transparent about what I believe, but also very welcoming and hospitable to people who have different points of view. And I think I like to think I do a pretty good job at that, because I think students feel comfortable telling me that they don't believe in those things, or they don't think that mercy, or they do think mercy and justice is incompatible. Like, I teach a graduate class in humanistic and phenomenological psychology, and the humanistic tradition places a lot of emphasis on empathy and a kind of agapic love, with a real strong, the humanistic word kind of gives you a clue that it's much more of an emphasis on a secular reading of these kinds of concepts. But the people who were in humanistic psychology were clearly drawing from theological sources and some of their thinking on this, but trying to translate it into secular terms, which is one of the things I think probably drew me to it. So when we're talking about those kinds of things, like I talk about Martin Luther King, for example, and his concept of the beloved community, and I express my position, which is an ethic of nonviolence. And I even, I talk a little bit about just war theory, that there may be certain conditions where we may need to defend ourselves, and what would those conditions be. So I'll share some of my views on that. But I use King as a way of talking about how to create, a community of loving relations. And I teach in a community psychology program. In fact, I'm director of a community psychology program. So I'm very interested in how do we create loving, healthy, thriving communities. And so King, I think, provides a framework for thinking about how to do that. I teach Rene Girard, who's a Catholic intellectual. And what I find is that it's really within the past. When I first started talking about King, for example, I didn't get a lot of pushback from students. In fact, there was a lot of support for that. But it's been within I would say, 5 to 8 years, I started to see a shift, especially within the past 3 to couple years, that when I brought up King, there was a hostility to that. Even saw that when at the American Psychological Association, we had a panel celebrating King's. I think it was the 50th anniversary of an address he had given at the American Psychological Association. I helped to organize a panel with people who knew King, talking about this event, and then we just by luck, we had somebody who was a photographer in the audience who videotaped the whole thing, and somebody had the good sense to ask them if we could have the videotape. So we had the whole thing videotaped, and then we got it edited and made a nice presentation out of it. So then we presented it at a conference, and I was kind of surprised at some of the backlash. Like, there was people who were, some African American people in the audience who were not. Who basically informed me that they didn't see King as really offering a vision that was useful to them anymore, and that this position of nonviolence, was a failed project, and that they were endorsing a more. It seemed to me, this isn't exactly their words, but I'm assuming, I think it was more of an adoption of a more militant position that was more willing to take a position that would be willing to be violent. If that's necessary, more like the any means necessary kind of Malcolm X kind of philosophy.
So does that come into thinking about the phrase that everyone is using these days is that we're in a cancel culture right now, right? Which really seems like it's the opposite of mercy, and and where I would say that if there's someone that has an attitude or a mindset that is very clearly wrong, well, then we need to do something to correct that, right? But especially where it comes in, where someone is basically kicked out of any venue because of something that they tweeted 6 years ago, and they're not even given this chance to explain it, right?
Right.
And so it feels like we are in an age where mercy is seen, I think, like you said, like a failed experiment, a way of peacefully solving problems, and you know what, we just have to fix it whatever way we can, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that I'm seeing that more and more frequently, whether it's with colleagues at conferences or students in the classroom or in entertainment, conversations in the hallways with people, and also on social media. I'm seeing a shift there away from a kind of mercy, a kind of the ethics of a kind of Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King, which is much more about moving towards a beloved community, or Gandhi, or Christ. That has really informed my thinking. I was really influenced by Dorothy Day, and how I think about issues around nonviolence, and that led me to dive deeply into the works of Gandhi and Martin Luther King and others. And I had a moment where I was reading. I went down to D.C. and visited King's monument right after it had been erected, and had a very moving experience doing that. And while I was there, I bought a book that has all of his speeches that he's ever given compiled into one document.
Wow.
And I just spent several months just reading chronologically through those speeches. And there's just, first of all, as everyone knows, whether you agree with King or not, is there a more eloquent orator that has ever spoken? He is just such an incredible orator. And he could just move you, even in writing, reading it and writing. And you can imagine that cadence that he talks and he builds in the course of the talk while you're reading these speeches.
And you could tell that he was a preacher.
That's right.
Yeah, he talked. Yeah,
that's right. He brought
and he was
that.
a good preacher. Yeah.
Yeah, he brought that to his oratory, and it was just really a very moving experience and a spiritual experience for me to read through this, his speeches. And there were some things that he said in there that on many occasions that were so moving that it brought me to tears. That it was like that almost I couldn't believe he was saying it. Like, one of the things was, I remember one of the speeches he says, "Well, I love the white man." Right? He talks about how and I'm imagining that I know what's happening at the time, right? That he's going in some cases marching with black, white, and brown people, fighting truly fighting for justice, for liberation, for the overcoming of truly unjust, racist social policy, and being met with absolute scorn and violence, and yet refusing to meet that violence and reciprocate it with violence. To me, it's like the essence of what it means to be a saint, in the sense of having a kind of heroic virtue, in this case, courage, being faced with mortal danger, in his case, literally sacrificing his life, and yet refusing to compromise his ethics, his ethics of nonviolence, and being willing to put himself in that position. And then to have him say, "I love the white man," even right now, I'm getting emotional just thinking about it.
Especially thinking about like you said, all the violence,
right,
back in that day. Yeah.
How easy it would, when I think about how easy it would be for him, and how sympathetic, obviously, I would be if he didn't love the white man, if he actually had contempt for white people. I couldn't really blame him for that too much. It was very moving. But I realized what happened in me as a white man was I felt like he was being sincere and he loved me, and that I wanted to return that love to him, and that ignited in me this passion to want to join him in his cause, in our common humanity, and as beloved children of God. And I think in that, I think what I felt, I think a lot of white people are struggling with guilt, about the history of this country and the history of slavery that, our bishops have called the original sin of the United States. There's something to that, in the sense that, an original sin is something that happens in the past that continues to have repercussions. Even though we may not have been the ones who committed the sin, we continue to bear the burden of the guilt of that. of that original sin.
And even realizing that we also, as white people, we also gain benefits because of past sin. That we,
right.
Even though we can say as much as we want that we are not personally racist, although I think that question itself is a very complex and not just a simple black and white. But to say we still benefit,
right?
But I think that one of the things I'm seeing, especially on social media, and next week Brent and I are going to talk specifically about social media and talking about emotional health online. But when you have this this culture of not seeing mercy as an option, of seeing justice of everyone needs to have their justice, and we need to cancel anyone that is in any way saying something that we think is wrong. That you get, I think that is one of the things that really leads to this polarization on both sides, where you are seeing people that are saying, I'm not racist, and yet but they're not willing to be nuanced about saying, but I understand that there are terrible things, and I understand that I have even played a part in that.
Right.
And on the other side, you have this, this seems like an attitude of you're wrong, and we just need to get rid of you, and no trying to find any connection, right?
Right. Both sides of that polarization fuel one another, right? Because when you're in a relationship that lacks mercy and forgiveness, then there's no room for mistakes, right? Because one mistake and you rupture that relationship, or that person retaliates, right, to harm you. And one of the things that's interesting is there's this law of reciprocity that you see that psychologists have been studying for a long time. You can even see in animals, when somebody does something to harm us, the tendency is to want to return that harm with harm. And it's a very natural inclination that we have. And the problem with that is that there's a couple problems with that. One is that when we perceive the harm that others have done against us, we tend to have what's called a self-serving bias. We tend to see that harm as maybe greater than it was because of just a basic perceptual bias, because we don't see the context of the other person's behavior. We just feel what they did to us. We don't know what their intentions were. All we do is make inferences based on the harm that we feel. So we tend to experience the harm that we have as being much greater than the other person experienced when they did it. That doesn't mean that we're not harmed. It doesn't mean that we don't have the right to speak to that harm and to confront that person about that. But and mercy and forgiveness do not in any way imply absolving the person of the wrongdoing, of saying that, oh, you didn't really do something wrong. It's actually trying to work toward reconciliation in that relationship. It may not mean that you're reconciled, but forgiving may be a pathway that gets you to reconciliation. It may not, but so reconciliation and forgiveness are separate concepts, but they're closely related. When I'm feeling particularly wounded and there's a mismatch and I retaliate against the other person, that they feel that my retaliation is unjust because they're like, well, that was such a strong retaliation for something so small that I did. So now they feel wronged and they feel that an injustice has been done, and then they feel they have to rectify that and maybe bring on some other people and their friends to help them to retaliate against.
Escalates.
Then it escalates. Then you get a cycle of violence, and whether it's a kind of it doesn't necessarily have to be physical violence to be violence. I mean, violence is really the intention to harm somebody, whether that's socially or, I remember reading an examination of conscience that really blew my mind, where they listed gossip under murder. That gossip is a kind of murder. And I was like, wow. I was like, they're right. It's a kind of social, you're murdering somebody's reputation. And I started, that had a big impact on me. I started really thinking about that. When somebody would come to talk to me and they would be speaking negatively about a peer, I would always try to either deflect the conversation or say something nice about that person, because I didn't want to commit murder, and then if I've caught myself falling into that, I would bring it to confession, because I realized how powerful that is. And there's an element to there may not be physical aggression that's happening, but when people's lives are completely destroyed because a whole gang of people work to try to have that person's life destroyed by isolating them socially, making everybody creating conditions of social rejection, separating them from their means of employment, excluding them from their community. It's like the contemporary equivalent of exile.
Right.
I mean, when they gave Aristotle a choice between exile and taking, the hemlock, he chose the hemlock. That's how bad exile is. To be alive and yet to feel completely abject within your culture is a horrible place to be. And now, so the interesting thing is, so that then when that begins to happen, then people become afraid of confessing. Right, of acknowledging their wrongdoing, because the costs are so high, and people become defensive, and then they rationalize their own hostility towards those other people because well, they're bad people and they're going to harm us. So you create this vicious cycle, and I think we probably are in a situation where, especially exacerbated by the pandemic, where we're already seeing it escalate into real violence, whether we're talking about and both on the left and right, violence that's erupting. It's occasionally in the news. I just saw in Portland, there was an altercation between, a Christian group and some Antifa protesters, and where you get the Proud Boys, and there's these you'll see on the news occasionally this boiling up into actual physical violence. It's not so pervasive now that it's like a Hobbesian war of all against all. Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher, talked about that, but it seems like we're on a slippery slope to that.
So how do we get out of it?
I
think the easy answer is forgiveness, right? But what does that look like in our modern day?
Right. Yeah. Well, easier said than done, right? I mean, this is. I think we're in a real pickle as a culture. Maybe that's an understatement. And that it's once you're in this cycle of violence, then it becomes very difficult to find your way out. One of the people that I've been looking to try to find answers to this problem in our culture is René Girard. Girard was a Stanford professor, and he spent his life studying these kinds of dynamics, how violence can escalate into a kind of war of all against all, and how that gets channeled into often scapegoating, where certain kinds of innocent parties, sort of get the brunt of that hostility. And I think that I'm seeing a lot of that now. It's like reading Girard now is just, it's like reading a description of what's happening all around us. Maybe it's always that case if he's right. But I like Girard's prescription. First of all, he takes a particularly strong position of nonviolence, because for the very reasons that I've been saying, because when you are willing to when you're willing to retaliate for harms that's been done to you through violence, whether that's, literal violence or this other kinds of social aggression, then the problem with that is it again leads to this cycle. But also he points something out, that there's a kind of unconscious we have. We don't recognize our own scapegoating as scapegoating, because it would be completely if we recognize that what we were doing is scapegoating when we're doing it, we wouldn't do it, because we would feel our conscience would prevent us from doing it. So somehow through social forces, he even talks about St. Peter, right? The denial of Christ 3 times as being this contagion where we get drawn into a mob and lose our capacity to set ourselves apart from the crowd rather than repeating the victimization. So Peter, even Peter betrays Christ, which he, prior to Christ's prediction, his prophecy, he would have never believed was possible. So so the important thing is that Peter, a saint, can do this, then we can all be drawn into these powers. Yeah. So we have to see it. I think a big shift is we need to shift from saying, oh, those people are scapegoaters and those people are doing this and that. The finger pointing is a big part of the cancel culture. I am a good person and I get honored by being victimized, and everybody else is the problem. And if people would just get canceled from social media or get thrown out of the culture, then everybody can live in a utopia. Well, if we start doing that, one of the things that we learn from the Christian tradition is that we're all sinners, and none of us are innocent, and we're all capable of doing these things, and only ever become even close to sainthood through grace, not through our own efforts.
The thing that I love about the you're talking about Peter and his denial is when I had this realization that at the end of the Gospels you had Peter's denial and you had Judas selling Jesus for the 30 pieces of silver. And when I realized that those were basically the same sin. They were both the denial of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And the important thing is looking at what they did next. Peter went back to Jesus and said, I was wrong. Please forgive me. And Judas went out and hung himself.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's going along with what you're saying, that, we need to see the issues in ourselves. Right.
Right. I need to see that's the first thing we need to do. There's somebody who's been a big influence on me in my thinking around these issues, in addition to René Girard, is Emmanuel Levinas. He's a French philosopher, a Jewish philosopher. Wonderful, right? He's difficult to get into at first when you start reading him because he's like a lot of French philosophers, very dense, difficult texts. But but when you develop a taste for it, and you it's like fine wine. You kind of have to, enjoy it for a while before you appreciate it. But reading Levinas, one of the things he stresses in the ethical relation that the ethical relation is always hierarchical. What he means by that is that the other is higher than me. What he means is it's asymmetrical. And what he's trying to get at there is like, I am always more responsible than the other. And it's whenever I teach Levinas, people always have a problem with that. They're like, what does he mean? Aren't we equal? Because it makes it sound like he's saying we're not equal. But I think what he's doing there is kind of ingenious, because he's recognizing that from an egoic perspective, from a self-absorbed kind of perspective that we all come from a Christian perspective because of original sin, from a psychological perspective because we're born self-centered and we have to find our way out of that through maturity. We have a tendency to, when people talk about social justice, we're not thinking about social justice for them. We're thinking about social justice for me,
right?
Because we're self-serving. And the trick is, as much spiritually and psychologically, the maturity is to shift from, wait a minute, I'm the one who needs to rectify his injustice, right? I'm the problem.
I need to be the one that asks for mercy.
That's right.
Right.
I need to be the one that asks for mercy. Yeah. And I can't expect that from other people. I think that's what King understood, is that because he was Christian and a deeply spiritual person, he understood that in the core of his bones and meant it when he said it, and because he had that grace, that spiritual grace that came through his prayer life and through his sacramental baptism and so on. And I think that we won't have a shift in the culture until we start moving into that asymmetricality where we realize I'm the one who's the problem. I am the problem here to start with, because I am a sinner. I can't overcome that on my own. I need
Right.
something beyond myself to rectify that problem.
Right. And so thinking about worrying about being canceled or canceling, and so instead of thinking, what did somebody else say or what did somebody else do, to really be bold and say, you know what, whether I'm canceled or not, here's an attitude of mine that I realize that I need to change. Here's something that I did that was not a great thing to do, and I'm sorry. If please have mercy on me if you can find it in your heart to do
That's
so.
right. That's right. Yeah. So I think that the danger for those who are being victimized by cancel culture, correct, who are being targeted by cancel culture, is to adopt the attitude of the victim, right, and to point the finger and say you're the problem. But I think the Christian thing to do, and I think the psychologically mature thing to do, which I think are the same thing, is to search yourself and look for mercy. And I think that if everyone starts to do that, I mean, then we start to get closer to that vision of the beloved community, when we're all searching and examining ourselves first. And also the other thing is, yes, sometimes we are persecuted, and I think it's true that cancel culture sometimes persecutes. It often persecutes people unjustly, targets people unjustly. That's the scapegoating phenomena, right? Where certain people get targeted who don't really deserve it, or the punishment is way higher than the crime, in some cases. So there's a lot of injustice that happens in I think cancel culture, even though they may have been precipitated by actual injustice that need to be reconciled. But I think that from a Christian perspective and from a Catholic perspective, the way I try to look at that is that, okay, if I'm being persecuted, that should be something I expect. I mean, it's in the gospel. Persecution is part of the life.
It's one of the things that Jesus said to us. This will happen. People persecuted me. They're going to persecute you. Don't be surprised.
If you're surprised by that, you need to read more of the gospel, because it couldn't be clearer that Jesus is saying, if you follow me, take up your cross. What do you think he means by that? You're going to have some crosses in your life.
It's not fun. Crosses aren't fun to carry.
No. So I think that we shouldn't go out looking for crosses to carry. But when life hands us those crosses, then we have to recognize that is something that aligns us to our Savior and to Christ.
Yeah.
And there is redemptive power in that.
Yeah.
When we take up our cross and we do it gracefully, right? In other words, with the grace of God, we can God doesn't, there's that, I guess it's a kind of a trite truism, but God doesn't give us anything that, that we can't handle kind of idea. But I think there's a truth to that. If you have faith, then you can love, even in the face of persecution. Those are spiritual, theological virtues that come from grace, and only from grace, you could say. And hope, the hope that even in periods of despair, that things will turn out, that justice will come.
And we can still respond in mercy and in love if we have that attitude. Right.
That's right.
And not an attitude of snapping back.
Right. The hope part, I think, is important too. Something that really struck me, it's on if you go and visit the monument to King in D.C., there's a bunch of quotes, and one of them is that the universe bends towards justice, I think I might be paraphrasing, but it's something along those lines. And that's faith. You have to have faith that there's a God, that God knows every hair on your head. It's like you're like, and be like the lily of the fields, and that you trust that God will provide. And even when you go through periods of persecution, there will be grace that flows from that if you continue to work on being holy through that. And that means loving those who are persecuting you, especially those who persecute you, because Christ says, and forgiving. Christ says to love our enemies. What does Christ say on the cross, right? He says, God forgive them. They know not what they do. That's how we have to adopt Christ. We have to become more Christ-like if we're going to shift the culture. And that means forgiving those. It doesn't mean saying that I'm not being persecuted. It doesn't mean denying what's happening.
Right.
But loving anyway.
Right. Well, I feel like we really just, in a lot of conversations like this, we just scratched the surface of
Right.
a lot of these issues. But not, it gave me a lot of great things to think about, and I think that hopefully we can start to try and move as individuals. And I think the more individuals that can do this, that can really think of how to be merciful, even when I feel like I'm being persecuted, and not lash out and not lash back. That that's where I think a lot of change will really come from. But I want to thank you for joining us. I think this is a long episode. We've gone a little bit long, but I think we've talked about a lot of good stuff. But come back next week. Brent is going to be back next week. We're going to be talking about emotional health, thinking about this. We've talked a lot about how to treat others in this episode, treating others with mercy. But I think that can be turned back on ourselves as well, treating ourselves with mercy and caring for ourselves. So next week, we're going to be talking about emotional health online, and especially in social media. So Brent, thank you for joining us. I'm looking forward to talking again next week.
Absolutely. Take care. Thank you.
All right.
It's an honor.
Thanks. And thank you for joining us on this new episode of Nerding Out with That Nerdy Catholic. I want to remind you that you can head over to Nerdy Catholic Tees. Nerdy Catholic Tees is the other little side of this Nerdy Catholic world that I'm building here. And I got this St. Michael prayer in Latin. And it's a prayer that I pray with my family every night. Powerful prayer for the protection of St. Michael the Archangel. So you can see that design as well as many others over at nerdycatholictees.com. If you use the coupon code ThatNerdyCatholic, you'll get 10% off of your order. I'll see you again next week. God bless.
System shut down.